So I will be presenting the Comprehensive Test of Nonverbal Intelligence, the second edition. So just to debrief on this newer edition of the CTONI, it of course is a nonverbal intelligence test. So it is designed to assess various abilities by using formats that minimize the influence of oral or written language. So the beauty of this is it does offer the option of choosing between a language reduced method or modality or a non-language test entirely, and non-language meaning that the entire content of the test itself and its required method for responding wouldn't involve words in any way. There would be no apparent verbal aspects, and examinees wouldn't be required to manipulate objects, read, write, or offer oral responses in order to take the test. So again, the beauty of it is that we do have the option between making it language reduced or completely nonverbal. The critical difference would be whether the instructions are administered orally, and the instructional aspect is really the only piece of the test that would introduce verbal modality in any way. As far as the examinee response method goes, it's just the simple act of pointing that's required. And this is beneficial so that examinees are not required to perform complex motor responses, because this could bias the test against those who have motor impairments such as cerebral palsy, or those who are recovering from stroke or brain anomalies, or even examinees who are just simply awkward. And then I've also just listed some revisions and updates that came with the second edition, such as the elimination of floor effects, which were present in the first edition. And this basically implied that the items were too difficult for those taking it, and a large portion of the participants would obtain or be closest to the lowest possible score of 0. So that was revised. The normative data and sample size was expanded. Fortunately, particular to what we've been covering in our course, we were able to account for more deaf in the normative sample, which is beneficial for us, especially as we go on to apply assessments to deaf and hard of hearing and interpret their results, hopefully validly and reliably. And there were new updates to the aesthetic designs and other things that have been listed. So to look at the CTONI test model, the overall aim of the test is to assess problem solving and reasoning skills in children and adults. Specifically, this could be really applicable to those who are dealing with either subtle or more overt difficulties or impairments in language-related ability or in making fine motor responses. And again, this test is looking to measure higher order cognitive abilities using a nonverbal format. And I think it's important to pay attention to that because being mindful of most other mental ability tests where there may be heavy language content or complicated motor response demands or expectations, and that can result in a serious underestimation of an individual's intelligence, especially when language and motor related impairments come into play, and that could then lead to faulty identifications, misdiagnoses, erroneous placements, low expectations and other undesirable consequences, and also looking across group membership, diverse populations and communities for those who come from cultural, linguistic, educational, or socioeconomic backgrounds that might negatively influence their performance on ability tests. The CTONI does try to account for that and be mindful of those differences so that those who are taking mental ability tests, the tests aren't biased against them or inappropriate. And so, of course, that being said, the CTONI 2 is most useful in evaluating the intellectual abilities of those who are language disordered, non-English speaking, deaf or hard of hearing, others who basically might be hindered because of language or motor related difficulties. we want to assure that they are given a valid testing opportunity and that their abilities are reflected accurately and appropriately. The age range for the typical examinee or candidate is from the age of 6 years to 89 years and 11 months. As far as the administration time goes, there's really no time limit or threshold. It typically lingers about an hour, I would say, but it can range from 40 to 60 minutes. It sort of depends on the examinee, and it can be administered with paper and pencil. So there are 3 higher order cognitive abilities or constructs that are measured: analogies, categories, and sequences. But they are looked at in 2 separate contexts, which are pictorial objects and geometric designs. And essentially, you'll take the 3 cognitive abilities and multiply that by the 2 contexts, and that comes out to 6 total subtests that are looked at and produce 3 overall index scores. So you'll see analogies, categories, and sequences, each represented in the context of just pictorial objects, and analogies, categories, and sequences represented just in the context of geometric designs, which would be the geometric scale. And the first that I mentioned was the pictorial scale. And then we have the overall full scale, which represents the overall ability score of the examinee on the test. It's considered the best measure of intelligence because it is the most reliable score, and it combines the scaled scores of all 6 CTONI 2 subtests. So it could be considered the better or the best estimate of Spearman's global factor G, because it reflects the examinee's status on a wide array of cognitive abilities. And the subtests can be measured independently, but the authors in the examiner's manual do recommend that all are administered. So this is just a glance at what the stimulus books look like, or the stimulus items, and what to expect when you're administering. So this makes up subtests 1 and 2, and this is the analogical reasoning section. And essentially the prompt will be that you ask the client or the examinee to look at the images and see if they can make the connection of the relationships or similarities. It basically looks at analogical reasoning, if they can match each image, this is to this as this is to which one of these. All right, and the next one, this one is for subtests 3 and 4, and it measures categorical reasoning, and it requires test takers to deduce the relationship between 2 stimulus figures and then select from the choice items the one that shares the same, that they think shares the same relationship with these stimulus figures. And then finally, we have sequential reasoning, and this uses more of a problem-solving progression format, and this is in subtests 5 and 6. The examinee is shown a series of boxes that contain different figures bearing some sequential relationship to one another, and the last box is blank, and you would have the examinee point to the picture from the choice options below that they feel completes the progression. And again, the examinee is just expected to point. And as a reminder, open communication about communication method and mode match between the examiner and the examinee is incredibly important before you begin administering. The testing method should be, or modality should be based on the preferred language or the needs of the respondent, and the examiner can, they have the option to administer orally or by gesture, pantomime, or sign language. If they do choose to orally administer, then the examiner is recommended to pantomime or demonstrate while saying the instructions. And again, the respondent would just provide answers by pointing out to their response choice. So the scoring is fairly standard. Responses are recorded on an examiner record form. There's 1 point awarded for a correct response, 0 points awarded for each incorrect response. There is no basal level. Everyone starts at the same starting point, and the basal is provided by the example provided. However, the examinee has to pass at least one practice item in order for a subtest to be administered. So if 3 consecutive errors are made on the practice items, then the test would not be administered at all. And there is a discontinue rule for testing in general, such that the ceiling is reached within 3 consecutive errors. Subtest raw score is calculated from the total number of correct responses, and it's then converted to age equivalents, scaled scores, and percentile ranks. And percentiles and descriptive terms are provided for composite scores. And this is just a brief checklist of what you will need for the day of testing. It's important to have the examiner's manual handy, the 3 picture books or stimulus books, and 25 examiner record forms. They provide translations of oral instructions for non-English spoken languages. And the testing environment, as we might expect for other assessments that we've learned about in class, you would want quiet, plenty of space, free of distractions, so that it's easy for both the examiner and the examinee to orient their attention, think clearly and focus. And there is space on the examiner's record form to record the setting and conditions of administration as well. So of course, it's important to relate the subtests that I've covered to theories of intelligence in order to demonstrate that the subtests actually measure the cognitive abilities that they claim to measure. There are 3 foundational theories of intelligence that connect with the CTONI 2. So test development was not guided by only one theoretical perspective. However, this does not mean that the test is atheoretical, but it instead drew from multiple theorists and sources. So our first theoretical rationale comes from Cattle-Horn, which is split into 2 constructs, one being fluid intelligence, which I know we've covered in class, and that decreases over time or with age. It covers a lot of abstract reasoning ability, being able to problem solve, think on the spot, apply our concrete knowledge to new problems or things that we face in everyday life, how we're able to apply what we've learned flexibly. And all of the CTONI 2 subtests do endorse the fluid intelligence construct, or at least that's what was evidenced in the examiner's manual. I know that Cattle-Horn also mentions crystallized intelligence, which was not as heavily endorsed on the CTONI 2. There was more of an emphasis on fluid intelligence. However, to give you a quick debrief, I know that we've discussed in class that crystallized intelligence is more accumulated knowledge that we gather from prior learning and experiences, and it involves less flexible application-based reasoning and instead represents concrete knowledge and facts that we've gathered throughout our lifetime. So looking at the CTONI 2, which looks more at reasoning and problem-solving ability, it makes sense that fluid intelligence would apply more so than crystallized intelligence. All right, and our next theoretical model is the DAS model of simultaneous sequential processing. And this looks at 2 types of information processing, but both types are necessary for high-level performance. However, they are distinct from one another. Simultaneous focuses on processing stimuli and information and arranging and integrating them into the brain at the same time. So it's more in a spatial, non-temporal manner. And this is endorsed by analogical reasoning and categorical formulation in both the pictorial objects context and the geometric design context. And then the other type is sequential, which is where information is arranged sort of step by step sequentially in the brain. And this is endorsed by categorical formulation in both the pictorial objects and geometric design context. So those are important connections to make and see how it applies to the construct that CTONI claims to measure, which is problem solving and reasoning ability. So keeping that construct in mind, the third and final theory or theoretical model that we have is Jensen's two-level theory of intelligence. And I'm going to focus on level 2 ability because that was more heavily endorsed by the CTONI 2 subtests, or it connected more closely with the constructs that were being measured there, because again, we're looking at reasoning and problem solving ability, and level 2 ability looks at cognitive learning, which pertains more so to conceptual learning, abstract thinking, how we problem solve, apply concrete knowledge that we've learned flexibly, and think through or look for solutions from and basically innovate new ideas. All right, now to review the psychometric information that I got from the manual about the CTONI 2. I just have some detailed information here about the demographics of the normative sample, and it essentially describes the data that was relied upon for this test development. And this information is important for other test users who are making the important decision of whether or not to use the CTONI 2, and including considerations such as who they can admit or cannot administer it to. Essentially, looking at the normative data helps us to determine whether we can assess any one person reliably and validly. So the normative sample was large and diversified. There were about 2,827 participants across the US. And they were, again, diverse, so selected based on a number of characteristics, such as age, race, gender, and something called exceptionality status, which essentially accounted for things such as demonstrated hearing loss, specific learning disability, developmental delay, ADHD, health impairments, and so on. And they were stratified by age into 19 different age groups. And now I'm going to dive into more of the important psychometric aspects of the CTONI 2, starting with reliability. This is a brief sort of portrayal of the 3 types of reliability that were assessed in the examiner's manual and reviewed, but I'll go into that in further detail. So again, as we've learned, reliability refers to the consistency with which a test can measure a certain ability. The CTONI 2 scores satisfied the most demanding standards for reliability. So starting with the first type that was assessed, which is internal consistency reliability, and that basically looks at whether several items that propose to measure the same general construct actually produce similar scores. And usually this means, I guess, the more the items relate to each other, the smaller the error in the test will be. So as you can see from the reliability coefficients that are listed across the subtests and composites, they all met the minimally acceptable level, which is considered to be 0.8. I think it's important to note that the full scale composite was reached near perfect reliability, which is really good for us. And again, going back to the fact that full scale is a better overall ability measure, it's a more close, accurate reflection of Spearman's G, which is a better representation of general intelligence. That bodes very well for the reliability of the test itself. And then moving into test-retest reliability, there was a study done for the CTONI 2. with a test-retest interval of 2 weeks. Both times it was administered in oral English, and the coefficients exceeded 0.8, so they were minimally acceptable, and the full scale composite was most desirable. But I think it's also important to note another study that they had mentioned that was done with the CTONI with students who speak English. And I think the test-retest interval was about 1 month, where pantomime instructions were used during the first testing session and oral instructions were used during the second testing session. And both instruction types yielded similar scores. So I thought that was important to draw attention to, that there wasn't significant difference in performance noted based on administration modality. And then the next type of reliability was inter-rater reliability. And this is basically assessing the amount of test error due to examiner variability in scoring. And this was tested by having 2 trained individuals score a set of tests independently. And all of the coefficients exceeded 0.9 in magnitude, so they were very desirable. And I think that additional subjects were tested to increase the number of cases in the deaf group for the normative sample overall. I think it added up to about 91 deaf people. And there was evidence of test reliability for specific subgroups. There were 11 subgroups overall that represented a broad spectrum of gender, racial, ethnic, and exceptionality categories, which included the deaf. And it was found to be equally reliable for all subgroups investigated, meaning the test contained little or no bias relative to these groups. However, I do think it's interesting to note, as you guys may have read in the cited article relating to the CTONI that Parkin and his colleagues covered, they found that most of the CTONI 2's items difficulties were low. And that was a really interesting finding, because it means that the CTONI 2 may not be able to capture as well the individual differences amongst examinees, and could potentially underestimate their cognitive ability. So that would be a criticism for the CTONI 2, and something important to consider when looking at these reliability estimates. I think it's important to keep in mind. Now, is this a valid measure of general nonverbal intelligence? So we already know that the subtests and composites are identifiable with theories of intelligence, and they have a theoretical foundation. However, I do think it's interesting to note some of the findings that we found specific to validity. Another supplementary article that was assigned for the CTONI 2 actually covered this. There was a differential item functioning analysis that was done and actually found statistically significant differences based on group membership for certain examinees, especially when making comparisons based on gender, whether they identified as African American versus not, or Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. And despite the fact that these were statistically significant differences, they were not found to be practically significant, which is something I think we should take note of, and was a really interesting finding. The next was construct identification, and this sort of looks at the degree to which underlying traits of a test, or what the test claims to measure, whether they reflect the theoretical model on which that test is based. And I know there are 3 separate theoretical models that I mentioned, tying back to the CTONI 2. So sort of evidence that bolstered this was the fact that we found a high correlation between the CTONI and CTONI 2 with other intelligence test batteries, and they were in a highly correlated range. It correlated with other math and reading achievement tests. So there was a high correlation between the CTONI 2 and other tests that claim to measure constructs that the CTONI also claimed to measure. So that was sort of a good way to verify the validity that we were measuring what we intended to measure. And also the contents of the subtests are shown to be in agreement with Salvia's list of behaviors. And these behaviors essentially tap into a broad range of cognitive abilities that are commonly assessed by most other intelligence test batteries. There was also a factor analysis done. So with the CTONI-2, we know that all the subtests claim to measure reasoning and problem solving ability. So as expected, they all loaded onto a single factor, G, that represents general intellectual ability. And there was ample evidence of the CTONI-2's predictive validity. The coefficients were uniformly high. The CTONI-2 was found to predict scores on intelligence and school achievement tests amongst a diverse sample of examinees. And these criterion tests are assumed to represent general intelligence. And so when tests are highly correlated, they're usually likely to be measuring the same or a similar ability. And then looking at the acceptability level, or analyzing the positive predictive outcome analysis, this basically is evidence of the effectiveness of the CTONI-2 in predicting other tests of intelligence. So to circle back to the sort of specialized aim of the CTONI-2, overall it is looking to assess the general intelligence of those who exhibit impairments or hindrances in language or motor related ability. It is highly recommended that you not use the CTONI-2 with those who are blind because of the pictorial scale, which relies heavily on pictures for its questions. But again, this test is quite beneficial because it can pose as either a language reduced or non-language test. So it's most optimal, or the most appropriate candidate for the CTONI-2 would be populations that have demonstrated hearing loss, are language disordered, have learning difficulties, are not native English speakers, maybe they're learning the language, or are multilingual, or potentially have suffered traumatic brain injury, aphasia, or other language disorders. Essentially, it's most useful to those for whom verbal testing might be biasing or inappropriate. Okay, move my, and finally, this is a final but important consideration when discussing the CTONI-2, is its suitability for use with those who are deaf or hard of hearing. So I've listed some of the pros and cons of the examiner's manual here based on the information provided that I felt either did or did not keep deaf clients in mind. So a wonderful thing was that it did provide guidance on administration accommodations and discussed the appropriateness of administering specific subtests through different modalities of communication. That was a large point of discussion in the test manual, and instructions for administration through sign language, gesture, pantomime, or other nonverbal means were really delved into. And I think one of the great advantages was that the use of gestures or relying on nonverbal means really minimizes the concerns regarding translation issues, especially for other tests that are notoriously verbal, written, or oral, and how we might translate that into ASL. There was also empirical assessment for possible bias, as I mentioned in the supplementary articles that we covered. It has been reviewed in the literature as it relates to this CTONI-2 being used for used as criterion for admission to special services, determining someone's disability status, gifted educational programming, and other cutoffs. I thought it was great that they acknowledged that and discussed it. There was inclusion of deaf individuals in the normative group. However, And yeah, I'll discuss this in what I felt the examiner's manual was missing. I feel that there could have been more guidance provided for test users when they're making the important decision as to whether the CTONI 2 is appropriate for use, whether their examinee makes the right candidate. And I also think it's crucial that they offer guidance for ensuring communication mode match between the examiner and the examinee. It's important to assure that communication is clear, accessible, and understood between both parties so that testing can run smoothly. So this would really call attention to an examiner's linguistic competence and the communication preference of the examinee. I think that's incredibly important. Also, there wasn't really any standardized information offered for an ASL translation of instructions. Essentially, yeah, just a standardized format for communicating the instructions in ASL, or if you were to try to translate the oral instructions, I think the authors could have gone into greater detail about whether an ASL translation would be acceptable. What are the implications behind that? Would anything be lost in meaning or translation? Is it a true translation of the instructions? I think that's important to review. Also, while there was a deaf group included, this was not a well-described group of individuals with hearing loss in this standardization sample. I felt that there was no information provided regarding key variables. I think they could have gone to a greater level of detail, like what was the homogeneity of the groups across individuals, what was the severity of hearing loss, how did it compare from one person to the next, what was their preferred communication modality, did they use assistive listening devices? I think all of these are really important to address. Looking at data from a group that's been labeled as deaf across specific subtests, I don't think is enough to work with. We're better able to interpret this information in specific context, such as looking at that degree of hearing loss and communication modality at least. And also if the deaf group was represented insufficiently or inadequately in the normative sample, then we may not quite have established test validity, especially looking into future reference, working with deaf and hard of hearing clients in general, and being able to make an adequate comparison and trust that the normative sample is a reliable reflection of what we can expect from our current clients. And in general, it calls into question whether scores obtained from our deaf and hard of hearing clients can be reliably compared to the normative sample. So I think that represents a limitation with how we can interpret the scores as a whole. And then to circle back to one of the takeaways that I think we've gotten from Dr. Day's class overall, and she's really reiterated this with us, especially when choosing to rely on nonverbal measures. Making this decision, we should really importantly consider the nature of the referral question. Why is this client here? And of course, unique to the examinee. What is their history? What brought them here? What was their upbringing like? What are current difficulties that they're facing? What are the goals of the evaluation? What do we hope to get out of it? What do we hope to learn? And then, of course, the language and fluency skills of the examiner, which I know we've discussed extensively, but I think that really applies here as well, especially when looking into nonverbal intelligence tests. So that wraps up my review, and I listed my references here, but thank you so much for listening.